I don't think any of us would go into this field if we didn't at some level have a kind of fascination for the complexity of people. One of the things I sometimes think about as I sit with people is what an enormous range of human experience there is.
You're listening to Conscious Mind, a show that explores what fascinates us.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our show. I'm here this morning with Dr. Andrew Gerber. He's our president and medical director here at Silver Hill Hospital. One of the most interesting people I know, and I'm thrilled to be interviewing Andrew this morning. And when I think about the questions that we have to ask, the original questions from the very first interview of this show, I thought, let's bring back those original questions, because when I think about these questions, I think these are Andrew-esque type of questions. I think we're going to have a fascinating conversation. So here we go. You ready?
I am.
Okay.
And let me just say thank you, Molly, for having me on. I'm a huge fan of your show. I love listening to it, and I always learn new things about people and see them in new lights. So it's an honor, and I'll admit, a little intimidating to be a guest, but I'm really excited to be here.
Yes. So what was the most interesting thing you learned in medical school all those years ago now?
Wow. It's a really interesting thing to think back on an experience that in many ways changes how you look at things that you thought you knew something about. I grew up in a medical family. Both my parents were doctors, and I was in and around hospitals, for a lot of my growing up time. And nonetheless, when you get there and it's you learn new things. So there's a whole bunch of things to choose from. But I'll tell you one that always stuck in my mind in a way that seemed counterintuitive at the time. And that is this notion that when you go down a road in terms of investigation in medicine, meaning deciding what tests to run, deciding what X-rays and MRIs and CAT scans, it always seemed logical to me. You just do everything you can, right? Because it's a mystery and you want to learn more. And one of the things that one of my teachers taught me in medical school is you've got to know why you're doing each one of these things. Because to do tests, to ask questions with no plan in sight, you could end up doing more harm than good. And that wasn't immediately obvious to me. I thought you just kind of did everything. And I think I have always kept that in my mind.
And how would you apply that to psychiatry? Because I could see with the medical side of things, as people think of it, even though we know psychiatry is medical, what could be harmful in investigating on the psychiatric side? Yeah,
no, it's a great question, and I think it's not immediately as obvious, but let me say it in a slightly different way when it comes to psychiatry. I think there's a kind of romantic idea sometimes in psychiatry that you're getting at some sort of core truth, and your goal as a psychiatrist, as a psychologist, as a social worker, as a therapist is to get the core truth and to get the person you're working with, the patient, the client, to see that core truth. And I think I've come over the years to think a little bit less that there is necessarily a core truth, but that there's a process. And it's the process of helping people figure out what's right for them. And that could be what they know about themselves. It could be the therapist that they find when they leave our hospital. It could be the next treatment program they're in. That's actually more important than some basic idea that I, as the treater, might have of core truth. And that's hard because I like the idea of core truth, and yet the more I see different perspectives, the more skeptical I am that there is just one core truth.
Would you say it's mostly or more about the relationship, like the process of sitting with someone and working through these questions? And if you're talking about the core truth, you're also talking about lots of other aspects of the person's life, something magic in that process of just human being with human.
I think that's exactly where I go with this, because if you have to give up one kind of, albeit romantic, idea of absolute truth, what do you grab onto in a sense in terms of what's your anchor? And I think it is the relationship. I think it's the sense that you're sitting with another human being who has another way of looking at the world by definition, because we all do. Even if we think, oh my God, this person thinks exactly the same thing I do, they never really do, and you never really know. But you can be really committed to and excited about the process of being curious and figuring out and respecting that person, and enjoying that back and forth process. And that, that applies to so many different things, right? I think it probably applies to interviewing people,
Right.
But it certainly applies, I think, to being a mental health provider.
Right. And when, you imagine that our patients and people that are coming to others for help, they've been trying to figure out what's going on with me
Right.
for so long. That
Totally.
just to be sitting with someone else who's just as committed to
Right.
figuring it out as
Right.
you are,
Right.
it must be, very powerful.
And I think we don't often recognize how hard they've been trying, because I think sometimes the experience when we work with our patients is oh, they don't want to know, or they didn't do the thing we wanted them to do. But I think intrinsically everybody wants to know, but it's a scary thing, particularly when it's out of your control. And if the idea that you come into some sort of a hospital or come into some sort of relationship with a treater, and they are going to be, quote unquote, the expert, and they're going to tell you, I mean, that's dangerous, right? Because how do you know you can trust them? How do you know they've got it right? I think many of our patients have had the experience of a lot of people getting it wrong. So I don't blame people at all for being reluctant, particularly early on. And our job is not to just sort of convince them, because I think that sounds too much like it's our agenda. It's to be with them, and then to have sort of faith in a process that they'll over time open up and there'll be a trusting relationship.
So I think by just talking it through, we answered the question that I originally asked, which is, how can you do more harm than good when it comes to psychiatry? So
Yeah.
thank you for doing that.
Sure. Hey, if you don't
yeah.
mind, it's funny when I answered that question, I remember that there was a second answer that I
Yeah.
had to the question of what
Yeah.
I learned in medical school, which I think goes with this one, but
Okay.
I didn't want to miss this chance to say this other one. So I have this vivid memory of sitting in a class. I think it was in my second year, and the teacher, who was this very, very, very well-respected, I think he was a pediatric hematologist. He said that he must have been in his 60s. He had gone back to his notes from medical school, his own notes, which right away scared me, because I thought, oh my God, I'm going to go back to these notes much later. And he said he estimates that about half of what he was taught was wrong. And that blew me away, because he wasn't that old, and he had gone to medical school. So let's say this was, this is the 90s, and so he'd gone to medical school, let's say in the 60s. And he's now saying that half of that is wrong.
50%.
Right.
Inaccurate.
And then he said, the biggest problem, though, is we had no idea which half.
Oh, wow.
And and he said to us, it's probably the same for what I'm teaching you today.
Well, and don't you think that's still true today?
Absolutely.
And I mean, there was some recent discovery in space that, like, the Big Bang and what we thought it was is not actually
Right.
what we thought. So I think in science, we're constantly reinventing what is reality and what actually happens.
Right.
So that makes sense to me.
Right. But it sort of changes the relationship with what you're doing, because I don't know that I'd start an interview with a patient when I first met them and say, hey, by the way, half of what I think I know about it is
Right,
wrong,
right.
But at the same time, at some point, we have to be honest about that. So how do you change the way you work to take into consideration the fact that what you know is so partial?
Right.
And by the way, that person was not a psychiatrist. So people are fond of saying, I'd like to say, oh, in psychiatry, we there's so much we still don't understand. The brain is so complicated. It's so much more complex than the liver or the heart or the lungs. But yet he was talking about the liver and the heart and the lungs. So if anything, it's more than half for us.
Right.
So I take it back to your point about the relationship, because that part I don't think is ever going to change. And how do you make sure that you've built a relationship that's based on the idea that we're going to do our best, and I'm going to admit when I don't know something, and you're going to hopefully admit when you don't know something, and we're going to get there together, even though there's so much uncertainty.
Exactly. We're going to tolerate uncertainty together. And I think so much of being human is tolerating uncertainty. What is this all about?
Exactly.
We don't, none of us really know. And I think in psychiatry, if a provider comes to you and says, this is definitely what you have, I'm right about that, there's danger in that. How can you prove that?
Right. And even if you thought you could, I don't believe it. Right.
And your patient probably won't believe you either.
Certainty, while comforting in the moment, in the long run, it gets you into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, it's unrealistic. So, good segue into what fascinates you the most about human beings, other than what we've already explored. What else about people interests you?
Yeah. I mean, so much, right? I mean, I think that's at some level. I don't think any of us would go into this field if we didn't at some level have a kind of fascination for the complexity of people. One of the things I sometimes think about as I sit with people is what an enormous range of human experience there is, because you can get into your bubble and you can think, oh, I kind of know how people are, right? And you think, I know people who are different and have different personalities and have different backgrounds. And then you'll have this moment, and sometimes it's when you're traveling and you're in a different culture. That's kind of the most obvious example. But sometimes it just happens when you're in your office or you're talking to someone and you see something that's very different. And it doesn't mean it's abnormal. It doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's different. And you think, I didn't know that before. I didn't let myself know that. And I just saw a different way of seeing the world that is as valid as anything else. And you'd think that would stop happening after a while, but it doesn't. And I think that's kind of, you can't quite predict when it's going to happen. And God knows sometimes things are kind of the way you expected them, but that happens often enough that I just get surprised that I kind of enjoy it, and I kind of look forward to learning new things that way.
And I think perception is such an interesting subject, because we could go down a major rabbit hole with how we perceive the world, how we understand other people and their behavior. You may think you're saying something in a certain way and someone is completely interpreting it a different way.
Right.
And how do you align those experiences so that people better understand each other?
Yep.
And then, on top of that, and we're going to get into, what we think the future of psychiatry looks like, but perception and, research and studies in psychedelic therapies and other things where, again, like a change in perception can change so much about how you think about the world. So with that said, what do you think the future of mental health treatment looks like? So I'm going to kind of combine these two questions of you were to get in a time machine and travel 30 years into the future. What does Silver Hill look like? What does mental health treatment look like?
It's a fun question because it lets me speculate.
Yep.
And listen, if 50% of what we know from the past is wrong, probably 99% of what I'm going to predict for the future is wrong. But that won't stop me from trying.
We'll see.
Exactly. So let me start with the field, because I have a fantasy about that, and it's a fantasy. We'll see how much, if any, of this pans out. But historically, in the field, we've really oscillated between two what have often seemed like opposing perspectives. One of which you might call a sort of more biological model of the brain and the mind that says there's these processes, most of which, and I'm parodying it slightly, but that we inherited, and they kind of work in this machine-like way, and mental illness is really when one of these processes goes wrong. Sort of built on the notion that the heart, and it's a pump, and it's a complicated pump, but nonetheless it's a pump, and if the electrical system is malfunctioning or the hydraulic system is malfunctioning, that's where the problem is. And that's one model of the brain and the mind that has over time risen and fallen, but has been with us. But then there's this other model that seems to be opposite, that says the mind is sort of this somewhat unknowable, ineffable set of processes, a little more akin to the notion of a soul, and it's so deeply interpersonal that it really requires its own model, and you just have to kind of embrace it as this unknowable thing. And that's also an appealing model to me in many ways, because it tells you something about sitting with people. It's kind of consistent with a lot of the things I think I said earlier. So the question to me is, can these two things really come together into a single model? And my fantasy for the future is that we will have a way of thinking of them together. And interestingly, I think the way we're going to do that is probably what we now think of as artificial intelligence. And we won't call it that then, because this is not artificial, right? But what do I mean by that? What I mean is, one of the basic premises of what we now mean by artificial intelligence is, when people built computer programs to play chess really well, or Go, or to use large language models like we do now with ChatGPT and so on, they didn't build a sequence of programs. They built essentially an associational network. They built this framework where, really driven by some large amount of external data, in the case of most of these things, it's fed from the web. But imagine this kind of model that's fed from all the sensory experience one has from the time one is an infant, one is born, you could even say still in the womb, up until you are now. And it's constantly being fed by all of this perceptual sensory information. And it's learning and deducing patterns, not in the conscious way we think of when we say, I'm going to memorize a formula or something, but in this kind of automated and sort of it's unbiased in the sense that it's just based on the sensory information that's coming to it. And that's our brain. And so at the same time, that is a physical object. That is a biological mechanism that is driven by neurons connecting with one another, by different regions of the brain being specialized in different things, by sensory mechanisms having certain characteristic patterns and individual differences. And at the same time, the emergent property out of this massively parallel connected network is a certain kind of pattern recognition intelligence, which we call a personality and a person. And so when we understand somebody struggling because they're depressed or they're anxious or they have psychosis, what I think we're going to know in the future, which we don't know now, is how that system is different. And I don't want to call it malfunctioning, because I think the system was responding to both its basic structure and by the sensory input that's been coming to it. And that intricate interplay between those two things then emerges into this massive structure. What's fascinating to me about this most recent, growth of ChatGPT and other large language models is we've been very comfortable saying things like, we don't really know why the model does that, right? People love to point out that, you ask it for, give me 10 references on some topic, and it, quote unquote, hallucinates some of those.
Wow.
It means we don't know. And so if that, which is, by the way, quite a bit simpler than the brain, has these properties that we don't fully understand, it makes sense that the brain has and the mind have these properties. But I think as we learn more about how these systems work, we're going to understand more about how the brain works. And not that we'll know it completely ever, but I believe that we'll understand and our treatments will reflect this much finer ability to combine what we now think of as psychotherapy, which is the tweaking of these inputs, with underlying biological mechanisms through medications and other forms of direct biological intervention. Those two things will fit together, I believe, much more closely.
So first of all, fascinating. I have so much I want to say in response to that. What an answer. And I think a realistic answer. So essentially, to sum it up, it's a massive amount of data collection from infancy or before, and then using machine learning as what we know now to look at that in a way that we haven't been able to as just regular human brains.
Exactly.
How might you collect this data?
So I've been thinking about this, actually, and I think a lot of people have. And there it goes all the way from the conventional, more conventional, to a little bit futuristic. So I'll let me sketch that out a little bit. So the conventional would be to say you ask people through questionnaires how they're doing, you record their symptoms, you have their diagnoses, you have their medical chart, all the stuff we're doing now, but you do it in a very systematic way, and you feed a lot of that data into a machine learning algorithm that can pull it together in ways that we haven't been able. That's the most conventional. But then you can start to think, well, what other data sources are there that maybe we haven't been using as much as we could? So, for example, one is the psychotherapy sessions, right? So right now, we do psychotherapy all across this campus. But what if we were actually feeding that data into some algorithm in a way? Maybe there are hints, maybe there are subtle patterns that are going on that we're not using as we might to really understand which treatments work best for which patients. What about wearables? What about the sort of psychophysiologic data that's become routine to look on your Fitbit or on your Apple Watch or something? You've got things like heart rate. You've got things like galvanic skin response, which is just a fancy name for, how moist your skin is, how much you're sweating. You've got things like heart rate variability, which is a more subtle way of understanding the way the heart responds to parasympathetic tone. All these things are potentially huge data sources because they're 24/7, and the technology is here, but we're not collecting them yet in ways that would be potentially analyzable. But let me sort of fast forward now, and I'm skipping up over a bunch of intermediate steps, but I'll tell you one that I've just been thinking about more recently. One of the most fascinating ways of probing the mind, it's always seemed to me, is word association. And this goes way back, right? And it's even a kid's game, but it's also at the root of some of Freud's ideas. It's come from many different things. That is, you say to somebody, don't filter your answer, don't think too much, just say the first word that comes to mind, right? I bet you could even do it in an interview, right? Not that I'm suggesting you do it. Well, what if you did that in a systematic way? So, for example, what if you had some sort of an algorithm where we would transmit information, it could be through a voice, it could be through reading, and asked people to kind of literally free associate and to just say the things that come into their minds and just to talk it through. And to, as best they can, not filter it out based on what they think the other person wants to hear, which is never completely possible, but you can help people do that, and you can even train them to do it more quickly. And what if you continuously collected that data, and then, with a computer algorithm, you probed, actually, that's kind of a scary word, so you you were
Queried.
informed. You queried. Thank you. That's way better. You were informed by the last thing they said to try another area. Now you might say, well, isn't that what we do in human conversation? And it kind of is, but we have rules around it and so on. And if you actually train some sort of a machine learning model to do that, you could actually understand what I would call the semantic space or the associational network of the mind. And you could map out a lot of these connections in ways that might tell you a lot about not just mental illness, but about personality, about patterns, about vulnerabilities. And so that's my kind of crazy prediction for the future, that one day that'll be one of the tools.
I was going to ask you, when are we going to start doing this?
Exactly. I think it'll be a few years.
Yeah.
I think we have to learn, and all this stuff obviously has danger to it, right?
Of course.
Because how we use this information is potentially scary. And throughout history, inventions and advances have been misused at times. So I think we have to be super careful to use these appropriately and carefully and really understand what we're doing and fully inform people who are engaging in this so that they know how they can stay protected with any new things we introduce.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Indeed.
So speaking of conversations, and this will be our wrap up here, conversations are something that fascinate me. When I get into a really good conversation with someone, it's like the world disappears around you, right? What's a great conversation you had with someone recently, and what about that conversation made it great?
So I think, like you, Molly, I love great conversations, and I love talking to people, and I love the sort of unpredictability in a way. But one of the things I also love is the energy one can get from that kind of almost improvisational kind of riffing off each other. And I find that sometimes I'll meet somebody and that energy will kind of flow into me. And by the end of the conversation, I'm just more motivated. I'm excited. I'm optimistic. Not falsely so, but I'm thinking about one in particular with a psychiatrist who I met. I think I first met her a couple years ago. She's actually the chief psychiatry officer for an amazing agency in Connecticut called Community Health Plan, and it's a network of medical clinics, but it also includes mental health and psychiatry as well. And she is an advocate for the people of Connecticut and to some extent people in the country who don't have the resources to pay for private psychiatric care. And you'd think that might make her cynical or might make her depressed, but somehow in her, it's just filled her with a kind of determination and energy, which I found contagious. And so we were talking the other day about advocating at the state level for better reimbursement for inpatient stays, residential stays, psychiatry in general. And even though this is a topic that I sort of think about and to some extent complain about or get angry about frequently, I didn't leave my conversation with her with any of those feelings. I left it with this excitement that there was somebody I was talking to and happened to be on Zoom who was confident and determined that we were going to make things better. And that was contagious to me because then I thought, hey, there's no room to be cynical in moments like that. There's just what's next to do. And I wanted to get to it, and I wanted to get the data and have the conversations and figure out who to talk to and really make changes at the state and even the national level in terms of how we pay for and structure our mental health system. So that was a really exciting conversation, and it keeps me going. And I know that she's one of those people that when I'm feeling a little bit discouraged or low energy, I can pick up the phone or I can reach out to her and know that I'll feel hopeful again.
It's amazing how we can energize each other in that way, and how working together we can accomplish such massive things that alone might seem, oh, there's no way I can do this, and I get, discouraged. And But when you have a partner, when you have someone who's excited with you and can share that optimism, I think it changes the whole game. So it's great to have people like that out there. And I hope she'll listen to this show.
I hope so too, and you should have her on.
Yeah.
Her name is Tishiana Arma, and she's a pretty extraordinary person. She's also now the president of the Connecticut Psychiatric Society, and one of those people out there who makes me very optimistic that we're gonna do better as a state and as a country to get mental health treatment to everybody.
Dr. Gerber, thank you so much for being here with us this morning. This has indeed been a wonderful way to start a Monday morning. And speaking of good conversations, this was an incredible one. So thank you.
Thank you, Molly. It's really a pleasure to be on your amazing show and to have a conversation with you that leaves me energized on a Monday morning and excited about Silver Hill and your work and everything we do to reach so many people. Thank you.
You've been listening to Conscious Mind on Silver Hill Radio. We'd love to hear from you. For questions and content submissions or ideas, please email us at silverhillradio@gmail.com.